For over the past 48 years, the American Indian movement has been taking a stand against the injustices towards the Native American peoples by the United States government. Though AIM was only officially established in 1968 by Dennis Banks, Clyde Belcourt, and Russell Means, AIM has unofficially been around for well over 100 years. AIM was initially formed to address American Indian mistreatment, treaty issues, and leadership, while at the same time addressing police harassment and racism against Native Americans forced to move from reservations. From November 20, 1969 to June 11, 1971, a group of Native Americans occupied Alcatraz Island as Native American land. Though AIM was not directly involved with the event, it did have a significant correlation with Native American protests to follow. One of AIM's first major involvements was the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972. The Trail of Broken Treaties was a cross-country protest held to bring attention to issues such as treaty rights and living standards. A total of 7 other organizations sponsored the protest. In Minneapolis, where the AIM headquarters is located, activists came up with a 20-point paper to define their demands. The protest began on the west coast of North America. Protesters traveled by car, bus, and van. The protest finally reached the national capital in early November, a week before Election Day. President Nixon refused to meet the protesters to receive the 20-point paper. Protesters were not happy with his decision, so they occupied the Department of Interior headquarters building. During the occupation, some protesters destroyed records, deeds, and burned papers. The standoff eventually ended a week later, with presidential aides negotiating with the protest leaders. After these talks, the federal government made peace with the protesters. They also decided to further. Just 1 year later, the Wounded Knee incident occurred. On February 27, 1973, 200 AIM followers took over the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. The protest followed the failure of the impeachment of tribal president Richard Wilson. Wilson was accused of abuse and corruption. In addition, the protesters criticized the United States government's failure to fulfill treaties. The protesters also demanded the reopening of treaty negotiations. AIM and Oglala protesters controlled Wounded Knee for 71 days. At the same time, multiple law agencies, including the FBI, the National Guard of 5 states, and the U.S. Marshal Service, cordoned off the area. The protesters chose the side of Wounded Knee for symbolic value. Both sides of the fight were armed. Dennis Banks and Russell Means were the main spokesmen during the occupation. During the battle, the military acquired 15 armored carriers, grenade launchers, rifles, flares, and about 133,000 rounds of ammo. All the equipment cost about $500,000. Eventually, the government cut off electricity, water, and food supplies to Wounded Knee. On May 5th, both sides reached an agreement to disarm. Many Oglala Lakota and AIM supporters began to leave that night. 3 days later, the battle ended with very few casualties. Wounded Knee was evacuated after 71 days of being occupied. After the 8.5 months of trial, Dennis Banks and Russell Means' charges of conspiracy and assault were dropped. In 1975, the Pine Ridge shootout occurred. One Native man, Joe Stuntz, and 2 FBI agents were killed near Jumping Bull Ranch, which had been illegally surrounded by more than 100 FBI agents. 3 members of AIM eventually were indicted for the murders. They were Darrell Butler, Robert Roberdeau, and Leonard Peltier. Darrell and Roberdeau were tried for acting in self-defense. Peltier was separately convicted. The evidence used to convict Peltier was planted shell casings from ammunition not used during the shootout. Peltier was convicted in 1976 and is serving 2 consecutive life sentences. Following these incidents, AIM was involved in events such as the Longest Walk. The Longest Walk was planned and organized by AIM. There were roughly 2,000 supporters at this event. The 2,000 walked a 5-month march from San Francisco to Washington Monument. They were protesting against 11 bills linked to Native Americans. Only about 24 people were able to survive the walk. More events include the Indian Welfare Act, which addressed and allowed the care and custody of Native children to non-Natives. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which promised to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent rights of freedom to believe, express, and exercise traditional religions, including but not limited to access to sites, use, and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship however they wanted to. Since about the 90s, AIM has been pretty inactive, with being involved in very few events. It is extremely important to recognize and acknowledge the true history of our country. Many of the events we've covered are not mentioned in our textbooks. Knowledge of the Native American history is very limited yet deeply ingrained in the historical context of this nation. The actions and events surrounding the AIM movement were brought forth as a way to bring awareness to the ongoing oppression of the original inhabitants of this country, a people largely forgotten and erased from our history books. In the years to follow, AIM will have inspired First Nation peoples to take a stand for their tribal rights and sovereignty granted to them under U.S. treaties. To this day, Natives are continuing in the laid path of their ancestors to secure and preserve their cultural and spiritual traditions, their way of life, and to protect the land for us all. Even today, Native Americans still have a long way to go as their land is still being treated unfairly. For instance, in North Dakota, the Dakota Access Pipeline was being built through Native American burial ground at Standing Rock Indian Reservation.
It just takes one little drone to fly over and expose the truth, and they haven't yet tackled drones. They may have shot drones down, but when you shoot one drone down, 5 more get resurrected. And it's the power of the world and power to support from the people of the world that support me and other drone pilots here, that they believe in what we do, and they 110% do anything for you to keep our vision and our dreams and our journey of exposing the truth. And also the power that drone gives the people here, that protection. When they're all on the ground doing actions, they look above and they see a drone hovering above them, they feel safe.
As the peaceful protests grew, the media coverage shrank and the riot gear increased immensely. The protests went on for months, but in early December, the Army Corps of Engineers announced it will look for an alternate route for the Dakota Access Pipeline. But the fight doesn't stop there. To this day, the pipeline is still being illegally built.